There once was a Planet Nine, RIP, but now there isn't. And before we get to the new Planet Nine, the potential new Planet Nine, what is, and maybe just to help understand what it means to be a planet, what's the rough story of why Pluto no longer classifies as our interstellar little brother? Or not our interstellar, I'm sorry, our intrastellar.
Interstellar, yeah.
Yeah, little brother.
Yeah. Fascinating story. Really one of my favorite stories in astronomy as to how it all came about. So the planet Neptune, okay, which is the place to start, was discovered first mathematically. Okay, it was predicted by Urbain Le Verrier in 1846, and then it was observed directly. Okay, then once this was done, there were a bunch of people trying to replicate the success of Le Verrier. Okay, they were trying to look for additional planets by using math. And most of those attempts, in fact, let me just be clear, every single one of those attempts from that era were all unsuccessful. Okay, but there's a guy named Parzival Lowell who was living in Massachusetts, who was also, kind of a gentleman astronomer. Like he was came from a very wealthy family, and he was doing astronomy essentially, I don't want to say as a hobby, but as sort of something that you can do when you don't really need a job. And so he was observing Mars and was convinced that Mars had canals. He had a specific reason for why this is. He was a pacifist. And so he envisioned this utopian society that lived on Mars, where the water was being shared from the part of the civilization that lived on the pole and to the equator area through these canals. And he was very upset at sort of what was happening in Europe in the early 1900s, and he was trying to envision and encourage people to live more like the Martian civilization. The problem was nobody else could see the damn canals, right? Because in fact, what he was almost certainly seeing were the blood vessels in his eye. Because when you observe it, it helps to look. You have higher precision if you look kind of to the corner of your eye into the telescope, and he was probably observing that, and he, at the same time, because nobody would believe him, in order to prove that he was a real astronomer, right, and that these canals really existed, he was like, well, what should I do? What's going to be like a totally OG, exercise that's going to make all my critics take a seat? And he was like, I should discover a planet, right, using math. That would prove I'm for real. Okay. So he hired a bunch of people to do the math, and the math they were doing is pretty interesting. They were looking, even though Neptune was discovered, some of the errors in the orbit of Uranus based upon which Neptune was predicted were still not fully worked out. And so they were trying to work those out by introducing another planet into the solar system. And they had predicted the 7 Earth mass planet somewhat further out than Neptune. And all of this was published around 1915. And then he died, right? So he died in 1915 or 16. But the Lowell Observatory, which was built in part to look for this planet, which is still very much going strong today, kept going. And eventually, this planet that they were looking for got sort of discovered, right? And it was discovered in 1930. And because, they were looking for something that was 7 Earth masses, when they saw anything that was beyond Neptune, thought, well, this must be it. And well, this has got to be, the 7 Earth mass object. But immediately there was a problem. So you see, if it was really 7 Earth masses, it would have been large enough to see in the telescope as kind of a individual disk, but they couldn't resolve the disk. So it was collectively decided that, well, maybe it's 1 Earth mass. Okay, like that was a rather arbitrary decision, but you have to remember it's very hard to measure the mass of something if it doesn't have a satellite. Okay, right? If it has a satellite, you can get the mass from the orbital period, but if you're just looking at an object and somebody asks you, like, how much does it weigh? Right? There's no way to answer that question. And so between 1930 and 1978, the mass of Pluto kept getting revised down slowly. It's like, well, maybe it's not 1 Earth mass, maybe it's like half an Earth mass. Okay, maybe it's like closer to like 20%. And so it just kind of kept going down and down and down. In fact, there was a comical paper that fit a function, like a mathematical function, to the mass of Pluto as a function of time, and predicted that Pluto would disappear in some year like 1989 or something like that. But when Chiron was discovered in 1978, the satellite of Pluto, it then became immediately clear that Pluto is a tiny object, right? It's 500 times less massive than the Earth. And its planetary status was really a legacy status. It was because what was being searched for was a 7 Earth mass object.
I see. That is so interesting. Because I guess I'd never really looked closely into it, and I'd always kind of begrudged the fact that it wasn't a planet anymore because I grew up with it being a planet. But I think explaining it in terms of the legacy status makes it make much more sense. But I just want to say I like that Lowell wanted to shut up his critics with his greatness, and then he immediately hired mathematicians to do the work. That just cracks me up.
I mean, look, I think frankly it was like kind of it was sort of the right approach to take. My understanding was that he was not the greatest mathematician himself, but he sort of understood the concept of like the Ford production line, and that if you have a lot of smart people working on something, like you can do a calculation.
Okay, well, still though, there remains one question to be answered about Pluto, and that is, what then determines whether something is a planet? So being less than 500 Earth masses apparently does not qualify it, but what are the qualities that would qualify it to be a planet or some X object?
Yeah. So there's a formal answer to this, right? Which is that there are like IAU guidelines on what makes a planet. And there are people that like to debate whether those are good guidelines or bad guidelines. They mostly define what a planet is not. So, you can reasonably say, well, these are not the perfect guidelines to be for a planet or whatever. But what they are is that you have to be a spherical, right? So you have to have enough mass to condense into a ball-like shape. You have to orbit the sun, which already, you can ask the question, well, what about extrasolar planets? And then the third one, which is the most critical constraint, is that you have to gravitationally clear your orbit. And what is meant by that is that you have to be a gravitationally dominant player in the planetary system. The way I like to quantify that final constraint is the question of, if you were to remove this object from the solar system, would the dynamics change? Or like, would its own orbit notice? Right? So if you were to remove, imagine that Jupiter is now a sugar cube, right? Would the rest of the solar system notice? Absolutely, right? The long-term evolution of the solar system would change drastically. But if you were to replace Pluto with a sugar cube, nothing would happen. No one's going to care. right? Even Pluto's orbit itself is not going to care.